So I think we have the technology now. So it's my pleasure to welcome Vernon Gale, who's Professor of Sociology and Social Statistics at the University of Edinburgh and Vice Chair of our Governing Board, to chair this session about Scottish devolution. And thank you, Vernon. Oh, you need this bit now.
Yeah, thank you. Is this fine? So as Michaela just said, I'm Vernon Gale. I'm Vice Chair of the Understanding Society Governing Board. It's a great pleasure for me today to introduce a personal friend and colleague, David Bell. David is amongst the best, or if not the best, panel data analyst you could ever meet. He's got a fantastically impressive portfolio of publications and grants, and as we would say, he's a well-kent face north of the border. David is essentially the sort of go-to guy for the Scottish media on a whole range of economic issues and also social issues, so he frequently appears late at night on your TV set. I've known David for about 20 years now, and his work's of an outstanding quality, but he's also got he's definitely got one attribute that I wish I shared, and I'm sure some of you will. And that's the attribute, which is this sort of incredible ability to sort of convey incredibly complex findings to people with incredibly low amounts of statistical knowledge. And that's a sort of skill that many of us don't have, and more of us should try and foster. I won't say too much more. On a personal note, Dave's an interesting fella. He plays golf from a handicap of 10 now, which I suspect is still on its way down. And he has an unusually deep knowledge of potato farming, and I won't tell you why. But he's a fantastic data analyst and a great scholar, and combines it with being an all-round nice bloke. So welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thanks, Vernon, and thank you for inviting me to talk around the somewhat difficult issue of Scotland's changing fiscal framework. So I'm going to talk a bit about what's been happening in Scotland, which I'm sure will have confused many people. It certainly confuses me. I'm going to talk about how that relates to changing tax structure, because that's what I've been particularly interested in. It also relates a bit to changing welfare structure, and whether understanding society can play an important role in trying to figure out what has been going on in Scotland in recent times. This is the thing which perhaps exemplifies that more than anything. This is the new electoral map of Scotland. So after the 2015 election, there are only 3 seats which are not held by the SNP. Prior to 2015, the SNP's locations were mainly in the northeast of the country, in the centre, and virtually none in the central belt, which was almost entirely held by the Labour Party. Complete change in 2015, other than one Conservative held on to his seat, and there's a Liberal seat in the Northern Isles, and somewhere there is one single Labour Member of Parliament. So what has been going on? A huge change, which has implications for the United Kingdom as a whole, fairly profound implications. So, a quick history of Scotland. I needed to look up actually Wikipedia to get the starting point, but it appears to have been 843. When Kenneth MacAlpin was the first king of Scotland. We had the Union of the Parliaments in 1707, so Scotland and England joined together. 1998, a Scottish Parliament was established following the victory of the Labour Party in 97. In 2012, the Scotland Act 2012, surprisingly, was passed, and we may have the Scotland Act 2015, which is currently on its way through Parliament. And then the question is, where are we headed to from there once it's passed? Are we headed for independence? Or are we headed for something called full fiscal autonomy, which I'll explain later, within the UK? So between the Scotland Act 2012 and 2015, quite a lot of things happened. We had a referendum on independence, and then we had the vow, that was Gordon Brown and David Cameron, Nick Clegg, promising Scotland more powers post the referendum if a no vote was the outcome. A commission was set up to propose new legislation, new powers for the Scottish Parliament under Lord Smith. It reported in November. Notice the length of time between these two events. It's quite significant and has a bearing on the quality of the report. And again, the length of time between the event in November and that in January, draft legislation was drawn up. That pretty much is now going through the House of Commons and may well be enacted by the end of the year. So let me take you a quick run through fiscal powers associated with Scotland since the 1998, the passing of the 1998 Parliament Act. Scotland, the Scottish Parliament got the power to vary the basic rate of income tax by up to 3 pence in the pound. It never used that power. In fact, the memoranda necessary to have it even put in place fell into abeyance because the Scottish Government forgot to renew it. As a result of the Scotland Act 2012, Scotland will have a control over something called the Scottish rate of income tax, which I'll explain later. It's got stamp duty, as we used to call it. It's got landfill tax. Those powers are in train. They're not all actually in place yet, but they're in train. As a result of the vow and the act that is now going through Parliament, Scotland will have nearly all of income tax. It will have a share of VAT. It will have air passenger duty, and it will also have a set of powers over the welfare budget. Welfare budget's about £15 billion. Some part of that will be become under the control of the Scottish Parliament. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to use various surveys, but mainly Understanding Society, to reflect on things like how is Scotland the same as the rest of the UK, because Scotland, in many respects, is the same as the rest of the UK. How is it different? And then I'll explain the current arrangements for arranging Scotland's funding and what the policy environment is like in Scotland, and then look at how this impacts on the whole UK fiscal environment, and then draw some conclusions, hopefully relate those to Understanding Society. So let me skip through some things fairly quickly. How is Scotland the same? Well, sometimes, and sometimes people from the Scottish Government don't like me saying this, I would argue that if you take all of the parts of the UK, you've got to be very careful about your language here. I cannot use the word regions, because Scotland is clearly not a region. But if you take those things which were normally things that the ONS used to split the UK up into, and look at their economic characteristics, then if you were to choose one part of the UK that was most representative of the UK as a whole, you would probably choose Scotland. That may seem rather strange, but on a whole lot of indicators, like this one, which is the monthly wages in the last wave of Understanding Society, Scotland is right smack in the middle. It's higher than Wales, Northern Ireland, and the more depressed parts of England, but well short of wage levels in the southeast. This next graph is a more complicated one, and I was using it in something I'd written previously to try to figure out if the Scottish Parliament had made a difference to the economic performance of Scotland. So I looked at things like how has Scotland's share of UK gross value added changed through time? And Scotland's share actually is pretty much like its population share. It's slightly below the UK average, but not very much at all. Its relationship, or the difference between the Scottish and UK unemployment rates, is a hair's breadth. So it's for a long period of time, Scotland's had about the same unemployment rate. For some reason that I don't fully understand, gross weekly pay increased sharply after the establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1998. I don't know whether that was because the pay levels in Edinburgh suddenly improved because of establishment of the Parliament, but it's still around 98% of the UK average, so it's not much different. And finally, net migration from the rest of the UK has been marginally positive for quite a long time, so there's been a net flow of people from the rest of the UK into Scotland. Let's go from the economic to the more social environment. Let's talk about identity. This is my guess, well, it's not my guess. It's what I worked out by amalgamating the first four waves of understanding society together. How many people, or what proportion of the Scottish population describe themselves as British? That is a key identity indicator. All people who live in Scotland, almost all people, would describe themselves as Scots. But the key question then is, that you might ask is, do they also describe themselves as British? And that proportion is around just short of 40%, and it's a bit higher in the rest of the UK. I'll use our UK quite often to describe England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So Scots are less likely to describe themselves as British than people living in the rest of the UK. However, this is some data which I took from the labour force survey, which rather peculiarly, and nobody ever notices, actually asks people a question about their identity. So this is pretty much matches the understanding society numbers, but the strange thing is that the trend since about 2006 in terms of identity is that people living in Scotland are more likely to describe themselves as British, which may seem a little bit puzzling. And there's a big debate in economics about why you should decentralize powers, particularly taxes and benefits and so on. And part of it is that you no longer identify with the central government. But in terms of identity, it's not obvious that the trends have been in any way moving in a direction that would suggest that the Scottish identity is parting company from that in the rest of the UK. There's then also three indicators that are used by John Curtis's British Social Attitudes Survey. He draws up indices of libertarian authoritarianism on the one hand. So you get a 5-point scale, and it would be it's a combined index made up of answers to questions questions like some crimes are so heinous that the death sentence is the only appropriate punishment. So you take 3 or 4 of those questions together, you form this scale, which seems to be quite well calibrated. It ranges between 0 and 5, and here is the numbers for Scotland, and those in the rest of Great Britain. The differences are not significant, though if anything, it appears that Scotland is higher or is more authoritarian, that our Scots are more authoritarian than our people in the rest of Great Britain. On the left-right scale, this I talked about this in the National Institute on Monday, and it was reported in the Telegraph yesterday, and I've had a lot of Twitter upset about this particular issue. But on the left-right scale, in answer to questions like there should be redistribution from the rich to the poor, which are the sort of questions that underlie this scale, Scotland turns out to be, if anything, marginally more right-wing than the rest of the UK. So it is not surprising that I've had some grief on this issue. On the question of welfareism, so this is, you should basically increase support for the needy. Scotland comes out marginally higher than the rest of the UK, so more sympathetic to increasing welfare, but again, not significantly so. So thinking about things that are the same, it appears that in terms of these kinds of attitudes, there isn't all that much to distinguish Scotland from the rest of the UK, and that is just not realised within the political culture. Political culture at the moment is that these are poles apart, these two parts of this island. Is Scotland more unequal? That's another issue that has been really part of the political dialogue in Scotland in recent times, that Scotland is an inherently unequal society, and that something ought to be done about this. Well, in terms of, for example, things like the Gini coefficient on gross pay, Scotland is somewhat less unequal than the rest of the UK, but really the big driver of inequality, if you think of it in spatial terms in the UK, is London. Household net incomes, I don't quite know what happened in wave B, but again, Scotland is slightly, in terms of Gini coefficient numbers, these are not big distinctions that we're looking at. Scotland slightly less unequal than either the rest of the UK or London. So not much traction in the idea that Scotland is different in terms of inequality. Then you get things like satisfaction with health, with life, and Scots are just about the same in terms of satisfaction with health, which is really quite interesting, and I'll come back to this because the objective evidence is that Scots' health is much worse. But in terms of describing themselves as satisfied, they're just about the same. The same is true about their satisfaction with life overall. Again, given that we know that there are big contrasts between countries on both of these indicators, these are remarkably similar. How is it different? Well, let me pick out one or two things that show that Scotland really is quite different. One of these is the proportion of people who have been born in the United Kingdom. Born outside the United Kingdom. This is the proportion of people that have been born outside the United Kingdom living in Scotland, about 2.5–3%. Only the North East and Northern Ireland, which doesn't seem to have anybody born outside the United Kingdom, have lower proportions. And as you go into England, South East and London, that makes there's a huge contrast there. So Scotland has people mainly who have been born in the UK. There's about 500,000 out of a population of 5 million who haven't been born in Scotland, but been born in England and other parts, Wales and Northern Ireland. Scotland is also very, very white. It's, the proportions overall in the UK are quite high, but in terms of white British, Scotland's about 94–95%. It is not nearly as ethnically mixed as other parts of the UK, except Northern Ireland and the North East. So Scotland is different in that kind of respect. It also has a slightly older population. So the effect of immigration, mainly concentrated in England, particularly the southeast, has been to boost the younger population in that part of the UK relative to other parts of the UK. So the Scottish population, not surprisingly, is somewhat older. So if this is just a density of by age, and there's a big gap. There's a gap here in the age groups 20 through to 35 or so, where the proportion of population in Scotland is lower, and then somewhat higher proportion beyond about 45. Now there was, this may look like a fairly incongruous picture, but it was implicitly formed a huge bone of contention prior to the referendum, because it was argued that Scotland's demography meant that should it go independent, it wouldn't be fiscally sustainable. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies made this point based on this somewhat older population. And in particular, that was driven by different expectations around health spending, future health spending, and again, linkages between health spending and the age structure of the population. So that, although seemingly innocuous, is quite an important point, and also has implications for pension liabilities for a fiscally independent Scotland. I just did some stuff to work out how many days people spent in hospital using Understanding Society. And you get to about the 96th percentile of the distribution before anyone really is spending any significant time at all. So if you ask people how many days do you spend in hospital, 96% of people say none. And then you start to get people kicking in with relatively small numbers at the 97, 98, 99 percentile, and these densities show pretty much the same point, but Scots seem to spend slightly more time in hospital than do people in the rest of the UK. Well, there are different interpretations of that. One might be that the NHS is more efficient south of the border and can get people moved through the health service more quickly. It might be to do with the objective poorer health indicators in Scotland. But if I go back here, I think this is an important point for understanding society, because what I was talking about here, implications for fiscal sustainability, the IFS made their argument that Scotland was fiscally unsustainable based on average health expenditure by age group. So you take the average by age group. And what this graph shows is that average may not be all that meaningful, that these distributions of things like hospitalization are incredibly skewed. So if you're thinking about how to manage overall health expenditure, then you've got to think about the extreme upper tail of the distribution and not just about what the average might be. And of course, if you're working solely on averages, you cannot get that level of detail, whereas if you're working with a large survey which captures the nature of the distribution, then you're in a much better position to analyze it. And I just cannot avoid putting this graph up, because it shows exactly that point about how skewed outcomes for health are in Scotland. And it's around health inequality in Glasgow. And this was done by a guy called McCartney, working in Glasgow. And sorry if it's a little bit dull, but what it shows actually is a train journey. The train journey takes you from a place called Jordan Hill, which is affluent university-type suburb, down to a place called Bridgeton, which is near Celtic Stadium and is in the East End, fairly deprived. And for each step down the line, you drop 1.7 years in life expectancy for men and 1.2 years for women. So men start, the life expectancy in Jordan Hill is 75.8, in Bridgeton it's 61.9. Their healthy life expectancy is in the mid-50s. For women, it's 82.1 in Jordan Hill, 74.6 in Bridgeton. So there are massive health inequalities in Scotland. And again, that emphasises the need to not think about averages, but to think about distributions. What else is different about Scotland is that, gosh, the Scots are really subsidised. Public spending per head in Scotland is considerably higher than it is in the rest of the UK. So if we call the UK as a whole 100, then spending per head in Scotland in 2009-10 was 113. In 2013-14, it was 115. So 15% per head higher public expenditure in Scotland. Northern Ireland's 23, Wales is 11. Scale matters here. If you brought Scotland down to the UK average, or indeed if you put Wales or Northern Ireland down to UK average, it would make hardly a jot of difference to the spend per head in England. So one hears people rail against the Barnett formula, which determines this, and I'll talk about that in a second. But there is no pot of gold out there. The extra spending wouldn't support massive change, massive increases in England. So, get a little bit nerdy now, because I think there are only 3 or 4 people in the world that actually understand the Barnett formula. And one of those unfortunately died last year. That was Lord Barnett. So the way that public spending in the UK, well, you're going to be brought into this small band of people, hopefully now. The way that public expenditure in the UK works is that there are 2 basic kinds. One are sort of welfare, largely, and that's largely what's called demand-driven. So a lot of it comes through the Department for Work and Pensions. The other is called DEL, Departmental Expenditure Limits. We're going to have a spending review in the autumn where departmental expenditure limits will be set for different parts of different departments in the UK government, like education, like health, like defence, and so on. It's to DEL that the Barnett formula relates. So when the spending review is agreed towards the end of the year, Scotland will know its budget for the next 3 years, depending how long they set the spending review for. So what happens is that for all DEL budgets, there's a baseline and then an increment, an increase. And Scotland will receive its population share of any increase that's agreed, or indeed reduction, that's agreed for UK departments. So suppose that health increases by 10%, then Scotland will get its population share of that 10% increase. So let's say that's worth 100 million, it would be worth more than 100. Let's just say it's worth 100 million pounds. Scotland will get 8.5%. it will get an increase in its budget of 8.5 million. It will just get the extra share of that increase. And that's how the Barnett formula works. It's arbitrary. It's entirely arbitrary, but that's the way it works. So it's arbitrary in the sense it doesn't relate to need. You know, Scotland might suddenly have had, some massive problem of Spanish flu, say. Its budget wouldn't change in relation to that. So basically, the change in the Scottish budget depends on its population share of whatever change is agreed at UK level. So that's what the spending review decides, and that will be equal to Scotland's population share of, let's say the UK government's running a balanced budget. That's certainly what it aspires to do. It's not yet quite got there. But let's say, so this tax revenue, it would only spend more if it increased its tax revenue. And suppose the growth rate of taxes in the rest of the UK is G, and in Scotland is G, Scotland, then that will be the increase in the tax revenue that will be spent, and Scotland will get its share. I put these up. You wouldn't think that's necessary, but it is necessary to understand something that's going to happen later on. Let me talk a little bit about the policy environment, because this is often not understood too. The Scottish Government has responsibility for health, for social care, for education, local government, justice, transport, and also for economic development and so on. And it has had these since time immemorial, and the UK government has never really interfered with Scottish spending on health or on education. So we have the strange thing of a 4-year degree. And the UK government has never interfered with the way that Scottish universities organise themselves. But the fact that, just coming back to understanding society for a minute, the fact that these policies are so different surely is an opportunity for analysis. I will come on to some particular ones in a second, but it is a massive opportunity for the use of longitudinal surveys that are the same on both sides of the border. There are, for example, some distinctive policies that Scotland is pursuing in terms of what's called free personal care in Scotland, which is something that the UK has visited through Dilnot, through Barker, and always kind of retreated from university tuition fees, where fees are free in Scotland. There are no tuition fees, but actually that seems to be quite a regressive policy. It is at face value, but it's also in practice the case that poorer people in Scotland face much more challenging loan repayment terms, which is not usually included in the discussion. And then Scotland also has free prescription charges. But again, since most people don't pay prescription charges anyway, the net effect of that isn't that big. The political effect is immense. You've got to separate the two. Let me just talk about one particular. Scotland is quite innovative. Part of the reason why the SNP gets elected is that policies in Scotland do tend to be quite innovative. And they set up the Commission on the Future Delivery of Public Services, and that is meant to switch the balance of public spending towards preventative measures. So early intervention. Now, I'm not entirely clear that anyone really knows what that means, but certainly all policies within the Scottish Government now tend to have to be justified on the basis of their preventative outcomes. And of course that's ideal for longitudinal surveys, because there may be a long time between the implementation of the policy and the better outcomes. There's also an aspiration to look at intergenerational deprivation and so on. Again, it's ideal for longitudinal surveys. And a specific policy that was passed last year forces Scottish local authorities and health boards to have a single budget integrating health and social care. This has been discussed in England, but it has been enacted in Scotland, and again, this is a huge opportunity for cross-border comparisons. How does arguably the biggest challenge that faces the health system, indeed, the whole budgetary system, is how to deal with the chronic conditions in the future. So again, lots of opportunities there, it seems to me. So let me talk about the changing fiscal environment. So prior to 2012, if you remember back the timeline that I talked about, this is the pre-2012 period. And this stuff that's sort of greeny, sand-colored is the set of taxes that are derived from Scotland that go to HMRC effectively. And all that Scotland collected was council tax, and you can hardly make that out, non-domestic rates. So that was the pre-2012 situation. After the Scotland Act 2012, which is still being implemented, it's not fully implemented, it's nearly there, Scotland gets council tax and non-domestic rates, but it also gets stamp duty, land value tax, land and building transaction tax, and a landfill tax. You can see that landfill tax is not going to make a huge difference to the overall budget. The big thing that it gets is what's called the Scottish rate of income tax. That's being put in place now. And of course, there's a lot of ramifications for that. Am I a Scottish taxpayer? That's a question that HMRC will have to resolve between now and November, because in November, the Scottish rate of income tax will have to be announced. So how might they determine that? So that's why HMRC are going into the health records, because one way to identify where somebody is might be to associate them with their GP. So there are lots of problems associated with this issue. But that's the big one, Scottish rate of income tax. After the Scotland Bill 2015 is passed, Scotland will have all of income tax. It will have a share of VAT. It will have a share of it will have council tax and non-domestic rates. But having complete control over income tax is massively extending the fiscal power of the Scottish government. So now you're getting to a situation where the block here is not quite as big, but getting towards the size of the block on the left-hand side. Notice this, I'm not saying anything about this at the moment. I'm keeping quiet about North Sea oil. If Scotland, however, went for what's called full fiscal autonomy, that means getting all of the taxes that are generated within the boundary, and then using those to fund all Scottish spending, and then making a payment each year to the UK government for common services. Now, common services would be things like defence, international aid, and importantly, debt interest, which is much bigger than the defence budget. So Scotland would make a contribution towards paying for those things, but it would keep all of its own tax revenues. So the thing that you might see, if I'll do that again. Can you see that actually it gets smaller? It gets smaller. Now, why does it get smaller? It gets smaller because, where are we? this one. This one was based on the original oil price, which was at about $120 a barrel just prior to the referendum. So that's there, and it's now down to here. The OBR's forecast for North Sea oil revenues have gone from about 5 billion to 0.5 billion in the space of 12 months. So oil, which in a way, it was always argued, compensated for the fact that Scotland gets high public spending, it also gives lots of oil revenues to the UK Treasury, isn't playing that role anymore. So that actually makes the whole full fiscal autonomy argument much less tenable, because Scotland couldn't really afford to pay this, make this payment to the UK government for international aid, for defence, and for debt interest. So the the Scottish government is much more quiet about this particular demand at the moment. You will not hear them saying, and tomorrow we want full fiscal autonomy, which they were saying immediately after the referendum. So the Scottish rate of income tax, just to explain it to you, here, let's just imagine that you earn 100,000, that you're paying income tax on that, and you would start off paying 20 pence. I'm afraid I've lost my pointer, but you'd pay 20 pence on from about 10,000 to 42,000. After that, you pay 40 pence, and 45 pence, not 50 pence, would kick in after you pay after you get £150,000. The Scottish rate of income tax says that you get 10 pence out of that first block. So you get half of the first block. You get £10 out of the second block, and so on. And what that does is to say, okay, this gives Scotland a share of its income tax revenues, but it does not give it control over the rate of progression or the size of the bands. So Scotland does not control really how progressive income tax is. That's what's coming into force now, but in the future, let me just skate over that. In the future, it may get complete control over income tax, but it could, for example, set the Scottish rate of in the future, it could set a starting rate at 15 pence, run that to 50, and then have a much bigger step, or it could do whatever it likes. If it gets full control over income tax, as the 2015 Act implies, then it can set the bands and the progression. What it cannot do is set the starting point, the personal allowance. That's important for reasons that I'll come on to. Okay, so, all right. So what would the Scots like? They've got these new tax powers. They could set the progression, they could set the bands, whatever. So we did a survey, the Centre on Constitutional Change, based in Edinburgh, did a survey and asked people how much they favoured moving the responsibility for taxes from London to Edinburgh. And things like the state pension, about 40% thought it should be fully devolved to Scotland. And this goes up to a housing benefit, about 55% think that it should be fully devolved to Scotland. And then another group thought it should be partially devolved. So, on average, around 70% of people are thinking these fiscal instruments should be fully or partially devolved to Edinburgh. Fine. Next question, ask those people who say they want the tax moved, whether they want the tax changed. That's a slightly different question. So you ask people, do they want the state pension to be higher, don't know, the same as the UK, or lower? So not many people want it to be lower. There's a surprise. Around, I would say 60% are saying the same or don't know. Let's look at income tax. Around 70% of people are saying the same or don't know. So you've got this demand for power, but then what we want to do with the power is absolutely nothing. It's called status quo bias, but it kind of implies that all this stuff is just a waste of time talking about this, because Scotland would just follow what the UK wanted to do, at least if the politicians follow what the electorate seems to want. So that's somewhat puzzling. So at the back of this is a complete lack of any principle, any logic. You find that other countries that start from a constitutional basis and move into a federal structure have a set of arrangements written into their constitution which specify how the different levels of government should relate to each other fiscally. The UK is making it up as it goes along. And there's no idea, there's no consideration about how, if you move taxes, who is bearing what risks for different taxes. It also starts to get into the territory of trying to figure out who actually controls macroeconomic policy, because if you go to the next step, which is English votes for English laws, then the English Grand Committee, whatever it's called, may have control over English income tax. And that is the biggest fiscal instrument in the entire UK government armoury. But would it lose control? Because it might be the case that England might elect there might be a different party in power in England from that in the UK as a whole. So that's one of the arguments why English votes for English laws is a bit of a problem. And there isn't much consideration about the cost of doing all this, which is the efficiency is an issue. And the size asymmetry issue is Scotland's quite small, so actually what happens doesn't matter too much. But if you start extending things to England as well, then the whole system is potentially unstable. This is the kind of track that Scotland is following if you compare it with other OECD countries. So you take what share of expenditure the subnational government is responsible for, what share of revenue it's responsible for raising, that's on the vertical axis, and Scotland has lots of control over spending. The Scotland Act 2012 gives it some more power over revenue. Scotland Act 2015 will give it even more power over revenues, and that will put it amongst the most fiscally decentralized countries, or part of a country in the world, alongside Switzerland and Canada in terms of fiscal decentralization. So, okay. Well, the question of risk is a really important one and was not thought through at all. So Scotland gets to raise all this tax money, but it's also got this Barnett formula thing that determines the block grant. So is the UK government just content to allow Scotland to raise all this extra tax money but make no adjustment to the amount of money, the size of the cheque it's sending to Holyrood? Well, surprisingly enough, the Treasury doesn't take that view. So it has a nerdy thing called the block grant adjustment, which determines how much money it's going to take off the cheque it sends to Scotland each year. And the way it works is it's down to a Welsh guy called Jerry Holtham, and it's pretty nerdy. So the Barnett formula itself is quite nerdy. This is even more nerdy. So Scotland spends, let's say, 30 billion a year, and that's the size. That's the check. Mr. Osborne writes the check, 30 billion pounds. Suppose that in the first year, Scotland raises maybe 4 or 5 billion in income in the Scottish rate of income tax. That amount of money will be taken off the cheque, so Mr. Osborne will only write a cheque for A, not A plus B. So that amount of money is taken off. The question then is, what happens in year 2? So in year 1, the Scottish budget is exactly the same as it was before, and that's going to be 2016-17, actually, that's going to happen. So there's no effect at all on the Scottish budget. In year 2, the size of the cheque depends on something. Let's say the Scottish economy raises the same amount of tax as it did in year 1. The question is, what happens to the size of A? What's the relationship between A and A star? Well, let me put it this way. The Scottish tax revenue has not changed. But if the tax base in England grows faster than in Scotland, that will determine the growth in the tax base in England will determine the amount that's taken away. So if the tax base in England grows by 5%, the Scottish tax revenue doesn't grow at all, then actually more will be taken away. This B plus this red bit will result in the cheque from the Chancellor, A star, being smaller than A. Now, people in Scotland just don't understand this. The issue is that the Scottish budget will only increase if Scotland's economy or its tax base is growing faster than the tax base in the rest of the UK. You know, it's not the risk here, if we're talking about how the allocation of risk as a key principle, the risk is around economic growth. Nobody seems to quite figure this. So that's oh dear, that's a bit. It's a bit nerdy, but I've got. Yeah, I won't bore you with it. That's the way it works out. It all depends on the relative rates of growth of the tax base from year 0 forward, the block grant adjustment. So the net effect is controlled by this particular issue. And what we've found, well, one thing to point out, which is important and quite easy to follow, but somehow or other the Smith Commission and all these other people that looked into this didn't notice this obvious flaw, or well, I think it's obvious, with this relationship. The right-hand term is the Barnett formula, which I've already explained. But I remember I said it was based on the Scottish population share. This other bit, the block grant adjustment, is not at all based on the Scottish population share. So you could get, so it's the growth in the tax base in the rest of the UK could be because the population in the rest of the UK is growing faster than it is in Scotland. Not that the average taxpayer is contributing more in taxes. So Scotland faces a risk, a sort of per person risk in terms of how much extra tax an individual can raise, but also a population risk in that its population might or might not grow faster. And so there's no consistency between these. I mean, there ought to be some kind of a debate, but the whole thing just doesn't make sense. And in fact, we've been looking at what effect, looking at the change in relative to, so Barnett, no different, but Scotland exposed to a situation where its tax base was growing slower than in England, population adjusted or not population adjusted, this is the difference measured as a share of GDP. If you have Scotland growing at 0.5% per year slower than the rest of the UK, by 25 years forward, you're down about 2% of GDP in terms of how much extra spend you can have. This is the 2015 proposals, and if you adjust that for population, the effect is much less. But the debate has not been had, and yeah, there we are. Anyway, let me just finish quite soon, but understanding society offers real opportunities, and we've done some stuff. We started working with some micro-simulation software to look at differences in tax rates and welfare benefits and growth rates, the demographic change and so on. And having that longer view is also important because you can see how things are evolving. This is a simple and not surprising result from a 1% increase in SRIT. So we do simple tax benefit modeling. The effect on household income, net household incomes across the different deciles of household income. So it's really the Scottish one that I want to focus on. It's losing out about minus 0.8%. With a 1p increase in the Scottish rate of income tax. However, there's another interesting issue here, that last graph actually wasn't all that meaningful because deciles isn't that important when you're looking at income tax. It's percentiles you should be looking at, because the people who are really affected are the ones at the top end of the income distribution. And here, we talk about labour supply. How does labour supply adjust to changes in taxation? You think of labour supply adjusting on the intensive margin, people adjust their hours of work. On the extensive margin, people drop out of the labour market or come into the labour market. We've got a new one. We've got a new one because we now are starting to think about migration. Will people move in response to higher tax rates? So I have a student who shall be completely nameless, who has made a lot of money, lives in Scotland, but is thinking very carefully about if there is a differential in tax rates, will he move his tax affairs? Because these people right at the top of the income distribution are the ones that are going to be hit hardest should Scotland have to vary its tax rate. So then the question is, what is the net effect on overall revenues if people are starting to move because Scotland is running higher tax rates? And we just don't know the answer to that. There has been work in other countries on this kind of issue, but we don't know the answer. So let me just talk about one more thing, and then I'll come to a close. One of the things that you may not have realised that's also happened is that welfare powers are coming to Scotland. So benefits for carers, disabled people, those who are ill, those benefits covered by the social fund. So the post-war consensus, I think, was in spatial terms that everyone, doesn't matter where they are in the UK, are covered by the same sets of insurances. Against disability, against bereavement, against unemployment, and so on. That seems to now have come to an end without any discussion, really. The Smith Commission wrote a report. That's it. Finish. You're going to have to adjust the Scottish, well, let me show you why you're going to have to adjust the Scottish budget. Scottish welfare budget's about £15 billion. These are the main elements of it, and lo and behold, the state pension, no surprise, is the biggest of these elements. These, on the right-hand side, are coming to Scotland. Disability living allowance, attendance allowance, carers allowance, industrial injuries benefits, and some really small ones that I can't read. How this is going to work, I don't have the faintest idea, because now you're going to have to increase the Scottish Block Grant to compensate it for the fact that it will have to be making payments for these benefits. to the Scottish population. And it does come into, it results in, well, there are already issues around the fact that Scotland offers free personal care, but it also, people in Scotland can also claim attendance allowance. And if you look at the rules for attendance allowance, they say these are payments made for people who need personal care, but Scotland gets it free. So how you work that has been somewhat of an issue for some time. So, and then how would you adjust the Scottish budget to account for the fact that it's now paying for welfare benefits as well, when actually Scotland's share of attendance allowance, for example, has been falling fairly consistently. The same with the biggest element, disability living allowance. Huge conundrum, which I think will be difficult to address. So, to finish, I'm sure you'll be relieved. What I've described is really having profound effects on the unwritten UK constitution. I mean, the fact that it's unwritten has occurred to me to be a bit of a problem, but there are lots of lords who will say that it's the best of all possible worlds. I think I could describe it as chaotic fiscal decentralization. Fiscal decentralization may be a good idea because the UK is a very centralized state, but why do it in this kind of manner? The Barnett formula had no rationale, things like Barnett formula has no principled rationale, and the proposed alternatives have even less. So that they may become fiscally unsustainable, in which case I think there's a fair chance that the UK would break up. The only thing I can say to console you, well, maybe you think that's a good idea, but this does offer great opportunities for social science, particularly longitudinal studies such as understanding society. And on that note, I will finish. Thank you.